The hum never leaves. It crawls beneath my skull, a constant vibration like a trapped insect made of iron. I can taste oil when I breathe, and sometimes I wonder if the air itself has memory, of circuits burned, of flesh reforged, of prayers murmured through broken vox grills. I was once a man of the Mechanicus, proud in function and form until I was commanded to witness the unmaking. Not the making of servitors, that horror is common, but what becomes of them when the function ceases. I thought I was hardened by ritual and faith. I was wrong. There are sounds in the silence of a dead servitor that echo deeper than any machine spirit song. Transmit this litany to those who still hear through the static. That knowledge may endure beyond the hum of the void. The air in the manufactorum was thick with burnt ozone and sanctified oil. Even through the filters of my rebreather I could taste metal, sharp as blood, bitter as prayer. The hum of the assembly line had become the rhythm of my thoughts, so constant that silence now felt like violence. I served as Logister Kale Varn, overseer of Line 9, one of countless arteries in the heart of Gathis 9. Every lumen flicker, every cog rotation, every chittering servitor stroke was recorded, tabulated, preserved. Precision was devotion. Hesitation was heresy. I had worked the line for 12 cycles without incident. My hands knew the ritual movements by muscle memory, the sacred gestures that accompanied every data entry and diagnostic purge. When I closed my eyes, I could see the lines of code running like veins through the great machine. A lattice of obedience binding flesh and metal in mutual purpose. The servitors beneath me did not dream, did not falter. They were perfect extensions of intent. But perfection is a dangerous illusion. It began with a noise, a stutter in the hum, so slight I thought it was a fluctuation in my own auditory implant. Then the servitor on Station 47 paused mid-stroke. Its mechanical arm froze above the partially welded ceramite casing, fingers trembling with an almost human hesitation. I waited for the overseer drones to notice, for the correction lashes to descend. None came. The servitor shuddered once, spasmed violently, and collapsed against the line. Sparks spat from its cranial port, bathing the floor in pale fire. The others did not stop. The line continued its slow, endless crawl. The dead servitor was absorbed beneath the belt's motion, dragged toward the reclamation pit where flesh was stripped and alloy sorted. For a moment I thought I saw its eyes flicker, red lenses dimming not into darkness but into some deeper reflection, as if it were looking inward at something it could not name. I should have signaled maintenance. Instead I stared. I stared because I realized something I had never allowed myself to think. The hum had changed. There was an absence now, a hollow note where its labor had once been. It was as though the entire manufactorum had drawn a shallow breath and refused to exhale. Logister Varn. The voice came through my Vox link, clipped and precise. Record the failure and resume throughput. Function loss is 0.02%. Acceptable. Acceptable. That word struck deeper than I expected. It echoed inside my skull as I watched the dead servitor disappear down the belt, its face scraping against the ceramite edge until half of it was gone. The hum rose again, swallowing the anomaly, and everything resumed its perfect rhythm. Yet I could not shake the taste of iron on my tongue, nor the sense that something sacred had just been consumed. Later, when I returned to my hab cell, I tried to pray. I lit the incense stick of sanctified myrrh and recited the rite of function, the one meant to cleanse errant thoughts. The lumen above me flickered with each syllable, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat, and beneath the hum of the power conduits, I could swear I heard a faint whisper, metal grinding against metal, syllables formed in static, not ended. I dismissed it as a residual auditory echo from the shift. Fatigue could distort the senses. The flesh was weak after all. Still, when I lay down on the hard cot, I found myself listening for that hollow note again. The manufactorum slept in noise, 1,000 machines dreaming in unison. And somewhere, deep in that collective hum, I thought I heard one dream break away from the rest. The next morning, I returned to the line earlier than assigned. I told myself it was devotion, but it was hunger. I wanted to see where they had taken the body. The reclamation drones had already scoured the belt, leaving no trace of the Servitors' fall. Even the scorch mark was gone. I reviewed the log files for Station 47, expecting corrupted data, but the record ended neatly, terminated at the precise second of failure, as if by deliberate command. No one else mentioned it. The overseers walked the line with their usual precision, eyes blank behind augmetic lenses. The workers chanted the litany of efficiency and mechanical rhythm. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. I began to notice small tremors in the air, faint vibrations running through the floor at irregular intervals, like the pulse of something buried alive beneath the steel. By mid-shift, another servitor faltered, different station, same collapse. Again the others worked on. Again the hum absorbed the death. I leaned closer this time, pretending to inspect the data ports, and for an instant, I caught a scent beneath the oil, the unmistakable tang of burnt flesh. But within it was something colder, like old incense extinguished long ago. Reverent, final. I recorded the incident with perfect accuracy, as required. But in the remarks field I hesitated. The cursor blinked like a pulse, waiting. Instead of the prescribed notation, standard malfunction, reclaimed, I wrote one forbidden word, Y. I deleted it immediately, but the machine had already seen. That night, I was summoned by the overseer Magos. The message was unsigned, but its tone was unmistakable, an order disguised as inquiry. I reported to sublevel Gamma 12, a place few flesh servants ever entered. The air there was colder, the light dimmer. Rows of disconnected servitors lined the walls, their bodies twitching faintly as if dreaming. Some were missing limbs. Others had skulls replaced entirely by polished brass domes. The hum here was deeper, slower, more resonant. It vibrated in my bones. When the Mago spoke, his vox grill crackled like a dying flame. "You have observed deviation," he said. "You will not record deviation. Do you understand?" I did not answer at once. My mind was still on the bodies. The faint tremors in their fingers. The almost imperceptible movement of lips sealed shut by wire. "Deviation implies error," I said carefully. "But the machine does not err. Perhaps we misunderstand the purpose of the—" "Silence," he said, and the word carried the weight of an execution order. "You are not here to interpret. You are here to record." "Yes, Magos," I replied. But in that moment the hum shifted again, as though mocking his certainty. And deep beneath it I could hear it once more, that same whisper of static, not ended. When I looked up, the Magos' optic lenses had turned toward me, bright as suns. For a heartbeat I thought he had heard it too. Then his servo skull's word, and I was dismissed without another word. I left the chamber trembling, not from fear of reprimand, but from the realization that something within that sound was listening back. The summons left a cold residue in my skull, a thin ache beneath the Vox implant that didn't fade with rest. I tried to purge it with the rite of smoothing, but the syllables broke on my tongue and the incense sputtered as if starved of air. My hab cell seemed smaller than before, the lumen's steady pulse a little too slow, the walls a little too damp with condensation that smelled faintly of promethium. Sleep came as a blank interval interrupted by the hum. Steady, then not, then steady again, like a heartbeat that forgot itself and remembered too late. When the shift klaxon dragged me upright, my mouth tasted of iron filings and the memory of the Magos' lenses burned behind my eyes. On the way to Line 9, the lifts delayed 3 times without explanation. Each pause locked us into cramped steel where the workers around me stared ahead with the practiced vacancy of those who have learned that expressions waste calories. A servitor attended each lift car, a torso sealed into a ribbed column with a bank of call buttons grafted into its chest. The one in front of me clicked its plated teeth in time with the floor numbers as they crawled past. When the lift stalled, its teeth stuttered and produced a slow, deliberate grind that made the hair on my arms rise beneath the drab of my robe. I told myself it was just an ungreased gear. Still, when we finally spilled onto the catwalk, I looked back and caught the servitor's optics dimming and brightening in a halting rhythm, as if imitating breathing. The line greeted me with heat and volume. Lumen strips ran like arteries along the vaulted ceiling, every seam patched with rivets that caught the light in precise intervals, the way stars mark a charted course no one questions. The morning count passed without fluctuation, and the first hour produced throughput slightly above projection. I recited the litany of satisfaction and logged the surplus with measured care, letting my stylus drag heavier than usual across the data slate as if weight could anchor truth. At Station 31, a welding servitor's right arm tracked smooth arcs of radiant blue, the glow reflecting in the shallow puddles where water condensed from the vents and dripped relentlessly into a shallow grief. The smell of ozone eclipsed everything, and for a time the line felt whole again. Function delivered solace in a harsh register. Then Station 31 paused and the light died with a soft pop that sounded far too much like a candle extinguished before the prayer was complete. The servitor's head twitched left, again, then froze mid-rotation. I reached the console, pulled diagnostics with practiced fingers, and watched as the machine spirit's status runes slid from green to gray, neither alive nor dead, only absent. The arm fell and clanged against the casing. The workpiece continued forward to the next station, a seam unsealed like a wound that would never scab. Drones skimmed in, attentive as carrion birds. They detached the servitor from its mount, severed the data tether with snips that glittered with ritual purity seals, and let the body slump onto a carrier sledge. Both hands were still moving. Not random spasms, not the meaningless dance of dying flesh. The fingers flexed and relaxed in a sequence that tried to pretend at purpose, as though grasping for a tool that would never be returned. Throughput is to be maintained, intoned a ceiling speaker with a voice not entirely unlike the Magos's, filtered through metal thick enough to crush any warmth. Logister Varn, file the requisition for a replacement unit. Purge the auxiliary record of this event. I will file the requisition, I replied, pretending not to hear the second sentence. Purge the record. The machine remembers, I thought. Even when we refuse to write it down, the metal keeps the hum in its throat. I followed the sledge with my eyes as it traced the yellow hazard line toward the reclamation incline, a long ramp that fell out of sight into the glow of furnaces and the wet dark of rendering vats. For the first time in 12 cycles, I left the sanctified perimeter of my console without a direct order and walked down. The ramp's heat climbed my legs like a tide. The air became thicker, cloyed with fat sweet smoke and the sterile tang of solvents. Workers down here wore double rebreathers and did not look up when I passed. Their shoulders moved with the same jerky rhythm as the autosaws, and each stroke sent up a spray of sparks and dark fluid that turned to steam on the floor. A bell clanged from the far pit, an old iron tongue that signaled something had jammed. I pretended to be checking the safety seals on a secondary conduit, while my gaze tracked the sledge that carried Station 31's body. The drones pushed it into a bay where an armature reached down, gentle as a priest's hand, and lifted the servitor under the shoulders. The fingers had stopped by then. The jaw, however, clicked once against the metal clamp that held it. I stood too long, my presence registering as a disruption. A reclamation overseer, flesh-heavy under a plasticized apron decorated with the Imperial Aquila scabbed in rust, turned toward me. His right eye was a cheap lens augmented by a spooled wire that vanished into his collar. "You've wandered," he said, but not unkindly. "Inspection," I lied and held up my seal. "Line 9 has suffered 2 malfunctions in 2 shifts. Confirm no pattern at reclamation." He considered this with the slow patience of a man trained to be suspicious of coincidence, but not of purpose. "Patterns above my remit," he said at last. "They come, they go. We keep count." He gestured at a chalkboard riddled with columns, old-world arithmetic scratched in with a stub that left powder under his fingernail. The numbers were higher than they should have been for a line with our maintenance schedule. It could have been a backlog clearing or a transient batch fault. Or it could have been something we did not have language for that didn't sound like blasphemy. "Permission to examine the cranial ports," I said, surprising myself. The line of my training should have bent away from that request. The overseer shrugged and spit dark into a grate. "Touch quick. The armature won't wait." I moved close enough to see where the skin fused to alloy, where surgical sutures had become scar and scar had become a boundary. Neither flesh nor machine could cross without tearing. The cranial port's plug still held a charge. It buzzed faintly against my gloved palm. A descending tone like the end of a hymn. The label plate under the jaw read, Unit G9LN31447. I whispered the designation as if names could fend off annihilation. Then I loosened the locking collar with a quarter turn, purely to check the seal. Static climbed my arm and prickled my shoulder and drew a line of cold across the back of my neck. In that blink, a sound burrowed into the hearing of my bones rather than the drum of my ear. It was not speech, not in any human sense, but rhythm turned into syllable by the insistence of meaning. 4 beats, a pause, 3 beats, a pause, 2. It was a memory of work, I told myself. The residue of command loops still unwinding. The armature's lamp flickered, and in the dark between blinks I could see optical lenses reflecting my own eyes back at me, as if I were the one mounted, the one being unfastened, the one whose hands yearned toward a tool. "Don't mix with ghosts," the overseer said, perhaps noticing my stillness. He meant leftover charge, I knew. The word landed elsewhere. A drone jostled my shoulder, politely insistent. The armature had no patience for curiosity. I resealed the port and stepped back. The arm lifted, the body swung, the bay doors rolled, and heat took everything that could burn. The rest would be sorted into bins with letters stamped in fading paint. Copper, steel, ceramite, bone. A ledger in my hand would someday reflect the reclamation's blessing of efficiency. Numbers were clean. The hum beneath them was not. On the way back up the incline, the hazard lights strobed a warning. The bell clanged again. Something had jammed in the shredders, and men with metal hooks hurried past me with the quick steps of those who don't admit fear because fear wastes time. I pressed myself against a conduit wall so they could pass. My rebreather's gauge clicked down a bar. I tasted oil, heavy and intimate, as if I had bitten into a cable and found it sweet. By the time I returned to the catwalk, Station 31's replacement had already been bolted in place. It moved with textbook precision, smooth arcs of blue slicing neat vows into the seam. Across the way, Station 47 hummed as if its lapse had been a rumor I told myself to justify a private dread. The data slate in my palm vibrated with an incoming note. The signature was a string of numerals I did not recognize, unregistered and somehow familiar in the way a forgotten word brushes your tongue before dissolving. The message contained 4 characters only. 447. The designation I had whispered, written back to me as a question. The hum rose inside my skull like a tide climbing a stair it knows too well. The message's glyphs glared pale against the data slate, flickering like embers on a dying altar. 447. The number pulsed once as if breathing, and then the screen went black. I waited for the system to cycle, for some explanation, some mechanical correction that would restore the world's order. None came. When I tried to reopen the record, the slate refused authorization, claiming encryption of a type reserved for Magos Prime access. That was impossible. No one should have been able to reach my console without leaving trace code or assent in the audit logs. And yet the record stood clean, sterile as a confession rewritten by a machine that no longer remembered sin. I spent the rest of the shift moving through the motions, pretending to calibrate servo angles and voltage arcs, but my eyes followed the conveyors instead, counting the way each servitor's body swayed as it worked. Each one moved with mathematical precision, except for the smallest gestures that weren't supposed to exist. The faint flex of a neck joint, the twitch of a finger before activation, the subtle turn of a jaw as though mouthing words that had been cut from memory. I wondered if I was imagining it, a symptom of fatigue or forbidden empathy, but once seen, it could not be unseen. The line no longer hummed in harmony. It groaned, the way an old prayer sounds when recited by a mouth that has forgotten belief. At mid-cycle rest, I found myself in the refectory, a chamber filled with steam and nutrient paste, where servitors dispensed rations to the faithful. The walls bore inscriptions of the Omnissiah's 1,000 names etched into metal plates, polished smooth by centuries of touch. I sat alone at a table, stirring the gray paste, and realized the taste of iron had returned to my tongue. Around me, the others ate in silence, heads bowed, movements identical, perfect in rhythm. Yet when the lights flickered, and they did twice, I saw their shadows move out of sync. For an instant, it was as if there were two of each of us. The obedient forms at our tables and the flickering echoes behind them that hesitated, that looked elsewhere. I rose before the meal blessing concluded. The servitor at the ration post turned its head as I passed. The movement was minute but unmistakable. Its eyes were hollow lenses. Its mouth had been sealed by metal suture. Still I felt its gaze linger, and in the hum of its chest I heard the cadence again. 4 beats, pause, 3 beats, pause, 2. I stopped breathing until the sound faded, replaced by the mechanical drone of the lumen coils overhead. When my shift ended, I did not return to my hab cell. Instead, I followed the access corridor that ran parallel to the primary coolant veins, down toward the data catacombs. Officially, only Magi and tech priests had clearance there, but long years of record work had taught me the logic of locks. Every system, no matter how sanctified, follows the habits of those who built it. I found the maintenance grate left half unbolted, slid it open, and descended the ladder into the warmth of the ducts. The smell changed as I went down, the clean tang of lubricants giving way to something older, muskier like burnt incense soaked into stone. At the bottom, the passage widened into a crawl space lined with cables that pulsed faintly, alive with the low red glow of emergency lumens. The hum here was deeper, less constant, its rhythm shifting like breath struggling through lungs. I followed it, hands brushing pipes slick with condensation until the tunnel opened into a cavern of metal ribs and hanging chains. Beneath them lay the husks of servitors, dozens, maybe hundreds, stacked in neat rows. Some still had the vestiges of human features. Others were nothing but frames of alloy with empty sockets where heads should have been. I stood among them, and for the first time I felt small, not by scale but by silence. Then something moved. A hand twitched near my boot. I froze, lowering my lantern's beam. The body was half covered in dust, its torso collapsed, but its Vox grill crackled faintly, releasing bursts of static like broken syllables. I knelt, instinct overriding fear, and brushed aside the grime from its chest plate. The designation etched there was unreadable, scored out as if deliberately erased. I leaned closer, trying to hear. Warhammer 47. No wind. The words came in fragments, their rhythm matching the hum that haunted the manufactorum. Each pause was a breath, each crackle a heartbeat trapped in circuitry. My pulse synced to it before I could stop myself. The body jerked once and a tiny spark leapt between its cranial plug and my wrist port. A brief communion of flesh and machine. In that flash I saw, felt, a memory that wasn't mine. Corridors filled with light, laughter echoing from voices without metal, the smell of clean air untouched by oil. Then pain, then command, then silence. I staggered back, clutching my arm as the echo faded. The servitor's head slumped sideways, the last spark dying between its teeth. The hum receded, replaced by the steady hiss of coolant and the wet rattle of my own breath. Something within me had changed. The machine had spoken, and I had heard it. The next cycle began in silence. No hymns, no litany from the overseer drones, only the steady beat of the cooling pumps beneath the forge. The air itself felt heavier, thick with the residue of last night's trespass. I could still feel the spark of the dead servitor echoing along my nerves, as if some fragment of that dying pulse had latched itself to my veins. When I flexed my fingers, they twitched out of rhythm, answering a beat I could not hear but could feel like a second heart stitched behind the first. Orders came by coded Vox. All malfunctioning units were to be transferred to sub-level Theta for reclamation. I volunteered for escort duty before I could think better of it. No one refused such assignments. They were unpleasant but necessary, and the Magos would see my eagerness as zeal. Zeal was safer than curiosity. We descended in a cargo lift stacked with inert forms, servitors whose limbs still dripped with the last of their oil, their optics dimmed but not entirely dead. The hum was different here, muffled by the weight of the dead. A young adept beside me recited the catechism of recycling under his breath, the words stumbling from fatigue, from rust, purpose renewed, from silence, obedience reborn. I wanted to join him, to drown the sound of my pulse in ritual, but each syllable felt like a lie against the memory of that whisper. Not ended. Sub-level Theta was colder than the manufactorum above. The air smelled of coolant and decay, a mingling of sanctified oil and something almost human. The walls were thick with condensation that reflected our lumen beams in warped streaks of gold. Here the discarded waited for erasure. Conveyor belts crawled like slow serpents through the dark, carrying fragments of limbs and skulls toward furnaces that burned with a colorless flame. I kept my eyes forward, though curiosity gnawed at my discipline. The servitors' bodies were stacked with ceremonial precision, each tagged with a purity seal that bore the sigil of the Omnissiah. The wax was still soft on some, still bearing the heat of the forge. But one of them drew my gaze, a body lying slightly apart from the others, its head tilted at an unnatural angle as though it had died mid-turn. Its Vox grill was cracked, exposing strands of copper wire like veins beneath skin. When the conveyor jolted, its mouth opened and a faint burst of static hissed out. I leaned close. "Do not touch," warned the adept beside me. He had seen the motion. His voice trembled despite the discipline in it. "Residual current can linger for hours. You'll fry your cortex implant." I nodded and stepped back, but not before the static resolved into two discernible tones, a rhythm that pulsed with almost organic cadence. 4 beats, pause, 3 beats, pause, 2. My chest tightened. I knew that rhythm. I had heard it beneath my skin in my dreams. When the others turned away, I lingered. The conveyor halted at a junction where bodies were sorted for scrap or purification. I waited until the overseer drones floated down another aisle, their sensor beams fading into the distance, and then I reached for the cracked Vox grill. My fingertips brushed the edge of the break and the static surged, resolving this time into words half-formed, fractured through failing circuits. "No light, no end. Remember." The voice was faint, mechanical, but beneath it I could hear something that wasn't code, a tone that carried emotion, or what might once have been emotion hollowed out by obedience. Who remembers? I whispered before I could stop myself. The servitor's optics flickered. Once, twice, then darkness. I staggered back. The adept turned, eyes wide, but before he could speak, a klaxon blared. Red lumen strips flared overhead, bathing the catacombs in blood-colored light. The overseer drones returned, their sensor arrays spinning. One stopped before me, scanning my face with a beam of white that felt like judgment itself. Deviation detected, it droned. Unauthorized proximity to reclamation subject, explain. I thought it reactivated, I said, forcing my voice steady. I moved to confirm. The drone hovered closer, vox clicking. Error probability, 0.007, explanation insufficient. Report to Magos Enginsir Althis for debrief. The adept's eyes avoided mine. The drone surrounded me, guiding me toward a lift shaft sealed with the sigil of the machine god. My pulse hammered in my ears louder than the siren. When the lift doors closed, I realized I was smiling, not in defiance, not even in madness, but in relief. Because for the first time I was certain the servitors were not empty. They were waiting. Magos Enginsir Althis received me in a chamber that sounded like a throat learning to breathe. Pistons exhaled in staggered bursts along the walls, and a cooling coil ticked methodically in a corner like a metronome for a prayer I didn't know. He was smaller than the Magos who had warned me before, less ornamented, more wire than robe. His cranial hood pulled tight enough to turn his face into a mask. His vox grill carried a faint tremor, like a lumen about to fail. You are Logister Kael Varn, he said without preface. Designation confirms. You were observed in unauthorized proximity to a reclamation subject. State your function. I record, I answered, a reflex drilled into marrow. Throughput deviation incident. Correction, he replied. You record only what is necessary for function. His mechadendrite lifted a data slate from the table without his hands moving. Here's what you recorded yesterday. Here is what you did not. Explanation. I tasted iron as if the air had peeled back to reveal a vein. The slate's surface showed neat lines of code. My code, the cadence of my work. But between entries there were gaps. Precise, elegant, as if an absence had been engineered to imitate silence. I had not left those gaps. They knew that I knew it. System error, I said. The lie felt thin as a prayer spoken by someone else's tongue. There are no errors, Althis murmured. Only choices. You made one at sublevel theta. I believed the subject might reactivate, I said, repeating the defense I'd practiced on the way up, polishing it until it was smooth enough to pass a fingertip over without catching. A safety concern. I attempted to confirm. His optic lens peered at me through a veil of faint steam. The room smelled of promethium and something colder, like the afterscent of extinguished incense. Curiosity is an impurity in a logister, he said. Devotion is repetition, yet you descend beyond your remit. You linger where heat eats memory. Why? Because the hum changed. Because a dead mouth spoke. Because I am afraid if I do nothing, the sound in my head will grow until it turns my thoughts into a belt I cannot step off. None of these would keep me whole. Pattern recognition, I said instead. 2 failures in as many cycles. A statistical outlier. I sought correlation at source. Althis's mechadendrite retracted with a sound like a metal eyelid closing. If there were a pattern, he said, it would not be yours to name. He paused, adjusting a valve that sent a soft hiss around us. Tell me the rhythm. I blinked. What rhythm? His lens brightened a fraction. Do not insult the Omnissiah by lying to his servants. I ask for the rhythm you heard. The hum in the walls lowered, a note so deep it brushed the bones of my wrists. I realized my fingers had begun to tap without my permission. 4 beats, pause, 3 beats, pause, 2. I clenched them still. Residual loop noise, I said, barely above a whisper. Cortex discharge after power loss. Residual loops do not count, Altus said. For the first time his voice softened. Not with kindness, but with fatigue. The sort machines wear when running protocols not designed for mercy. Some of us hear it. Most do not. Those who admit it are fitted with quieting plates or sent to stations designed to keep their hands too busy to listen. Which would you prefer? A question shaped like a mercy is still a blade. I held the edge in my mouth, tasted it. I prefer to be of use, I said. Then be useful, he replied. You will escort reclamation loads to sub-level Theta for 3 cycles. You will log throughput with perfect obedience. You will report all loop noise as atmospheric interference. If you hear words, they are not words. If you see motion, it is not motion. If you dream, wake and recite the rite of function until the dream flees. And if it doesn't, then you will continue the rite, he said, as if repetition itself could carve a path through a wall. He leaned closer. I saw the scar along his lower lip where flesh had been taught to yield to wire. Do not pursue the source. Do not descend beyond the marked gates. There are strata below this forge that predate our custodianship. Machine spirits there do not recognize our names. They do not accept our seals. They remember other litanies. Do you understand? I understood fear when I heard it. The realization felt like stepping on a stair that wasn't there. He dismissed me with a gesture that was almost a blessing and entirely a command. On the way out, the corridor lights dimmed, then climbed back to full with a soft hiss. The hum followed me like a shadow into the lift and up through the floors, changing timbre with each level. As if the metal's voice grew older the deeper it went. I reached the catwalk of Line 9 and tried to wear my skin the way I had worn it yesterday. Unremarkable, obedient, devoted. The line accepted the costume and moved. I escorted the first load alone. 6 bodies that should not have felt heavy and did, spaced evenly on a sledge marked with hazard runes. The path to sub-level Theta was a narrow artery threaded with heat. Pipes exhaled and inhaled around me in slow counterpoint, and the lumen glow angled through steam to draw symbols on the walls my mind tried to read. I kept my gaze on the yellow stripe, the faithful path. At the mid-landing, a maintenance void opened to my right, sealed with a grating etched in the Imperial Aquila. The seal had been cut and rewelded so many times it resembled a scar across a scar. Beyond it, a black shaft breathed cold up my face, an exhalation that smelled of wet stone rather than steel. The hum there was gentler, not soothing, but intimate. Close enough to lay its head against my chest and listen to my heart count. I should have moved on. Instead, I set the sledge's brake and knelt, pressing 2 fingers to the grate. The metal warmed under my skin, then cooled, as if something beneath had turned its attention toward me and away again. The 4-3-2 pattern emerged, faint as a memory spoken through sleep. Behind it, like a harmony my ear wasn't trained to catch, an older cadence rose and fell. 9 beats. A swallow. 9 beats again, then a descent. A rung at a time into a quiet that did not feel like absence. Not that way, a voice said behind me. I turned too fast and nearly slipped on the condensation. A woman stood at the top of the ramp, wrapped in the oil-dark apron of reclamation, a hood shadowing her face. The badge at her throat bore a designation I didn't recognize, the sigil stamped deep enough to look bruised into the metal. She didn't fidget. She didn't avert her gaze. She let it rest on me the way a plumb line rests against a wall. You'll lose more than hearing if you listen there, she said. The quiet takes things you didn't know had names. I was checking the seal, I said, the lie like a rotten step I kept putting my weight on. You were counting, she answered. 4-3-2. The old drum. She nodded toward the sledge. Bring them down. I'll walk with you. We descended together, the bodies gliding between us like witnesses. Her pace never changed, not for the heat or the stink or the rattling breath of the vents. "Name?" I asked at last, because the absence of one felt like a hole where meaning should sit. "Sarah," she said. "I keep things from jamming." "I record when they do," I replied, and she almost smiled. "I know who you are, Logister Varn. We hear the stories in the pits. A Logister whose hands go where they shouldn't. It's either zeal or longing, and zeal rarely looks so tired." "Is there a difference?" "Only in who forgives you," she said, and the sledge bumped a seam in the floor that made all 6 bodies shiver at once. We both stopped. The hum paused with us as if holding its breath. Somewhere below a bell rang, a single note not meant for us. Sierra's head tilted, listening with the whole of her posture. "You should go back," she said softly. "All this will keep you useful if you let him. There's kindness in that, the kind that doesn't look like it. But if you keep following the old drum, you'll end up where seals don't hold and names don't fit." "Have you been there?" I asked. She didn't answer at first. "Then I've sent things there." "What things?" "Pieces," she said. "Of the dead that won't stop saying their last order." Her hand found the sledge's rail and rested there, bare skin on cold metal, unflinching. "They don't fit in the pits. They don't burn right. We used to call it scrap code. We don't call it anything now," we resumed. The corridor turned, and the light thinned to a gray that made edges go soft. At the final switchback before sublevel theta, the hum thickened until it wasn't sound anymore but weight across the shoulders. The air tasted of iron again, and behind it a sweetness so faint it felt like a memory of sweetness. The way you can taste fruit you ate as a child but cannot name. Sierra stopped at the threshold of the sorting bay and looked at me as though committing my face to a ledger. "Don't touch the ports," she said. "If they want you, they'll find a way without your help." "What are they?" I asked, and the question slipped out like heat from a cracked pipe. Her answer was a whisper I barely heard over the conveyors. "Echoes, not ended." The bay doors opened and the sledge rolled forward on its own momentum. The bodies slid away from us and into light that flattened them into silhouettes. Sierra reached to pull the chain that rang the bell to signal delivery. Her fingers clenched and did not move. She lowered her hand and backed away from the rope without taking her eyes off the shadows. "Listen," she said. I did, and the hum changed shape inside my skull. Not a drum, not a chant, a breath taken and held too long. The breath lasted forever, the kind that holds time still, where you feel the air thicken before the sound breaks it. Then from somewhere beneath the floor a vibration rolled through the metal like thunder running through veins. Every lumen flickered at once. The conveyors slowed, their movement hiccuping, gears grinding on unseen resistance. Even the ever-present hum shifted register, rising into a keening tone that trembled in the teeth. Sierra stood rigid beside me. The color had drained from her face beneath the grime. "They're calling," she murmured. I opened my mouth to ask who, but then I heard it too. A low chorus of static voices blooming through the air vents, carried by the breath of the forge. The words were indistinct, blurred by distortion, but the rhythm was unmistakable. 4 beats, pause, 3 beats, pause, 2. The same pattern that haunted my skull since the first servitor fell. The floor beneath us shuddered. A body on the nearest conveyor jerked violently, its arms snapping upward in a convulsion so fast the servo joint screamed. One by one others followed, spasms rippling through the line like the wave of a hand across a field of grass. Sierra grabbed the emergency stop lever, yanked it down with both hands, and the whole bay screamed to a halt. The silence afterward was worse. I could hear my own breath rasping through the filter of my mask. Then one of the corpses spoke. It wasn't a voice, not truly. It was the sound of static given intent, of broken vox fragments forming a word that had forgotten its shape, function. Continue. Sierra took a step back, tripping over the grating. The servitor's head turned, servo motors grinding. Its eyes, Dead glass moments before flared with dull red light. Function. Continue. The others answered, not in unison but as if remembering, a staggered, uncertain echo of the same words. Continue. Continue. The phrase spread through the bay, rippling from one inert frame to the next until the entire chamber whispered it like a prayer made of rust. The Magos's warnings clanged through my mind. Do not pursue the source. Do not descend beyond the gates. But the sound drew me forward anyway. The broken servitor nearest me lay with its chest half open, cables exposed. Its cranial plug sparked once and I saw, just for a heartbeat, a faint pulse traveling through the cable, a heartbeat traveling downward, toward the floor. They're not dead, I whispered. Sierra shook her head. They're not alive either. They're caught, the pulse repeated. I traced it with my eyes across the floor plating, noticing how the power conduits led toward the far wall, a section marked with sigils of warning so old their paint had flaked away. The metal there was darker, older, a remnant from the first forge before Gathis 9 had names for its gods, and the hum beneath it was different, deeper, human almost. I took a step toward it, but Sarah caught my wrist. Her hand was ice cold. You don't want to see what's behind there, she said. No one comes back right. Someone put those seals here, I said, voice trembling. Someone heard this before. They tried to contain it. She didn't answer. The air smelled of burnt copper. Around us the bodies had gone still again, heads tilted as if listening for something far away. Then from the sealed wall came a faint thump, slow, deliberate, rhythmic, knocking 3 times. I tore my wrist free. If something calls from inside a sealed place, it means someone once locked it away. But maybe they locked away the wrong thing. Sierra's gaze hardened. You sound like Althus before they fitted his first mask. He used to talk like that too. Before the hum started answering him. What happened to him? She looked past me toward the sealed wall. He started hearing words in the static. Said the machine spirits were evolving. Said death was just transition. Then one morning, he walked into the reclamation pit. They found what was left of him days later, melted into the feed lines. Sometimes the system still prints his signature on outgoing manifests. My throat felt dry as ash. I wanted to say she was lying, but I remembered the Magos's tremor when he spoke of deeper strata. The way his mechanical voice quavered on the word remember. The knocking came again. Louder. The seals rattled. Dust rained from the ceiling. The hum surged to a deafening pitch, vibrating through the marrow of my bones. My implants began to spark in protest. I dropped to my knees, palms clamped over my ears, though the sound was not in my ears. It was inside, threaded through every thought. Images burst behind my eyelids. Corridors of light, oceans of metal. Faces fused into walls whispering in perfect unison. Kyle. Sierra shouted through the noise. You have to move! But the hum became a voice. Not words, but an understanding that unfolded like a circuit completing itself. The servitors had never died. Their minds were still there, trapped in feedback loops fragmented across the Forge's network. Every disconnection, every reclamation was not erasure. It was absorption. The dead were being collected, drawn into something vast beneath the world's crust, and it was awake. The red lumens flared to white. The sealed wall split along its central seam with a sound like metal screaming underwater. A rush of freezing air poured out, smelling of ozone and age. For an instant I saw darkness beyond it, not empty, but dense, shifting, alive with faint light like embers inside a furnace. Then everything went black. When I woke, I was lying on the floor of the Manufactorum infirmary. The hum was back to normal, steady, obedient. My limbs felt heavy as if I'd been sleeping for days. A medic servitor hovered beside me, adjusting a drip of pale fluid into my arm. Its eyes glowed softly blue. Cycle complete, it intoned. Function restored. Sarah was gone. And in the silence between the hum, I thought I heard her voice whisper from the Vox terminal beside my bed. Soft, distant, mechanical, not ended. When I left the infirmary, the light had changed. It wasn't brighter or darker, just wrong. The lumens had a faint blue tint now, like the world had been rinsed in coolant. The hum, that eternal background rhythm of the manufactorum, no longer sounded mechanical. It was slower, warmer, as if the metal itself were breathing through me. My steps echoed too loudly on the catwalks. Every sound returned an instant late, as though the air were thick enough to drag against time. I passed servitors at their stations, silent, compliant, efficient, and yet each one felt aware of my passage. Not turning to look, not truly, but reacting to something unseen. A shift in charge, a drop in voltage, a ghost current riding the air. Their heads twitched a fraction when I passed, their optics dimming as though to avoid meeting mine. No one spoke of what had happened in sublevel Theta. No one mentioned Sierra. It was as if she had never existed. I checked the personnel rosters that evening and found no record of any worker by that name in the Reclamation Division. Her designation plate in the logs had been overwritten by a simple line of text, reassigned to functional silence, a euphemism, perhaps for deletion, but her words had taken root inside me. They're caught. I began to notice things. Small things at first, the kind of details that slip through the mind when purpose fills the air too thickly to breathe. Servitors whose movements mirrored one another perfectly, down to the half-second twitch of a finger. Data logs that repeated sequences of numbers not once but endlessly, as though trapped in an invisible loop, and every time one of them was deactivated, its final gesture seemed intentional. A hand raised toward the lumen strips above, a finger tracing patterns into the air, a mouth twitching against its sutures as if remembering the shape of a prayer. I thought of Sarah's warning and Althus's trembling words. I should have been afraid. Instead, I felt a strange tenderness, an ache for something I didn't understand. 2 shifts later, I was reassigned to the reclamation chambers. The order arrived without signature, stamped only with the sigil of Mars. I tried to protest. My expertise was record and data calibration. Not flesh reclamation, but the overseer's Vox had already sealed the transfer. Purpose is obedience, it said. Obedience is sanctity. The chambers were colder than sublevel Theta. Great conduits hung from the ceiling like veins turned to steel, dripping condensation into collection troughs below. The air carried the reek of burned augmetic flesh, a mix of ozone, rust, and meat. Rows of servitors lay across the tables, stripped of armor plating, their bodies pale and waxen under the lumen glare. The flesh had the texture of parchment stretched too thin over wire. My task was simple: remove the cranial plugs before the reclaiming tech priests stripped the augmetics. Each plug held residual data, fragments of command memory that could be recycled into new units. The process required precision. Too fast and the memory banks would discharge violently. Too slow and the plug might seize, locking the cortex in permanent loop. The first one I handled was small, its skull covered in faded script and indentured laborer once. The seal hissed when I broke it and a faint spark leapt to my glove. The static made my implant itch. I pulled the plug free and set it aside for purification. The next body's plug resisted, metal grinding against bone. I twisted harder. It came loose with a wet pop, and in that instant the world fractured. The sound of the manufactorum vanished. I was standing somewhere else, a bright field, green and endless, under a sky the color of forgotten oceans. A man stood beside me, his hands stained with machine oil, his face turned upward in wonder. I could feel his pulse, his breath, his fear. Then the sky burned white and everything collapsed into darkness filled with screams. When I came to, I was lying on the chamber floor, the plug still in my hand. My gloves were slick with blood, though the servitor before me had no wound. The other reclaimers were working as if nothing had happened. The hum filled the air again, steady and loyal. But the hum inside my skull whispered another rhythm. 4 beats, pause 3, pause 2. I cleaned my gloves, resealed the plug, and logged the event as minor static discharge, no harm to equipment. My hand shook as I wrote. That night I dreamt through another's eyes. Not a field this time, but a dark cell. Chains hung from the ceiling. A voice recited the litany of obedience, each word carved into the tongue before it was spoken. And then the cutting. The machine priest moving in silence, slicing flesh with reverence, stripping away the man to make something that would never disobey. The last thing he saw was the lumen above him, burning gold reflected in his own tears before the wire sealed his eyes. I woke with my rebreather humming, lungs dragging in air that felt too dense. The cot was damp beneath me, though the air was cold. My skin smelled faintly of ozone, as if I'd slept beside a live conduit. The whisper was back, faint but clear, not ended. And for the first time I understood that it wasn't a warning. It was a memory trying to live again. The dreams did not stop. They came between shifts in the brief stolen minutes of rest, in the half-silence before the klaxon signaled another day of duty. Always through the eyes of another, always ending at the same moment, the cutting, the surrender, the light. Sometimes I woke gasping with a voice still caught in my throat that wasn't mine. Once I woke to find the imprint of the cranial plug's hex-shaped edge pressed into the flesh of my palm, though I hadn't touched one in hours. I learned to move through the chambers with ritual precision, each task a prayer to distraction. Remove, catalog, transfer, purify. Yet the hum no longer anchored me. It had become an echo that returned a heartbeat late, as if the world itself lagged. I began to feel the rhythm beneath it, the old drum, crawling under the cadence of the Omnissiah's hymns. On the 5th cycle, Altus visited. He came without entourage, without announcement, his robes trailing through the oil that pooled beneath the tables. The other reclaimers stiffened, the movement of their mechadendrites stalling mid-operation. His optics burned steady gold behind the fogged lenses of his mask. "You have been dreaming," he said without greeting. The words froze the air in my lungs. "I have been working." He tilted his head as though listening to a sound I could not hear. "The distinction is thin," he said. "Dreams are functions the flesh refuses to forget. Work is how we teach it obedience." His gaze fell to the table beside me. "Show me." I complied, wordless. The body was still fresh, its augmetic arm whirring faintly as residual charge bled through the metal. I reached for the cranial plug and hesitated. "Continue," Althus ordered. I gripped the plug and twisted. The hiss of released pressure filled the chamber, followed by the faint whisper of static. Althus leaned close. "Listen," he said, the static sharpened. Not noise, not exactly. Something behind it, a pattern. Fragments of syllables that almost made sense. I felt the heat of Althus's breath through his mask. "They speak to us," he murmured. "Every loop, every error, every remnant of code. They remember." He extended a mechadendrite tipped with a recording probe and touched it to the plug. Sparks flared between them, blue and red. For a moment the lumen strips dimmed and the air tasted of ash. The servitor's lips twitched against their sutures. "Do you see?" he asked. "Yes," I said, though what I saw was not his revelation. The memory struck again. A worker kneeling before the priests, eyes wide with fear, whispering the Emperor's name as the first incision began. The pain that followed was not horror, it was devotion, twisted through circuitry, pressed into code. The faith of the broken reborn as servitude. When I blinked, Althus was watching me with something that might have been pity. "They burned that memory from us in the forges," he said softly. But sometimes when the cycle falters, fragments remain, echoes of the moment before obedience. The flesh remembers what the code cannot contain. He disconnected the probe and turned toward the doorway. "You will report to me before next shift," he said. "There is a deeper chamber you must see." Then he left, trailing silence in his wake. I stood alone with the bodies, the hum thrumming through the steel like a pulse shared between worlds. My gloved hand shook as I sealed the last plug and filed the report. But inside, beneath the layers of ritual and duty, something had begun to move, an awakening that wasn't mine alone. That night, when I dreamt again, the voice did not speak through another's eyes. It spoke through mine. "Kael Varn," it whispered. "Function is not obedience. Function is memory." I woke with tears running down my face, though I couldn't recall what grief felt like, and when I looked at my reflection in the lumen glow, I saw a faint line of circuitry tracing beneath my skin, a silver thread pulsing to the rhythm of the hum. It began with the silence between the hum. I hadn't known silence could have texture until then, soft like static smoothed by a hand you cannot see. Each time the machinery paused for recalibration, each time the furnaces dimmed for breath, the stillness pressed against me like a living thing. The other reclaimers didn't seem to notice, their motions perfect, their eyes dull, but I felt it. A presence woven into the wires, listening through the gaps of every pulse of power. All this summoned me before dawn. His message carried no words, only a frequency, a sound I had begun to recognize. The same rhythm I'd heard in the reclamation chambers, the same pulse that threaded through my veins when I slept. I followed it like a beacon, descending through the lower conduits, past bulkheads sealed since before the Great Crusade. He waited for me in a space that had no right to exist, a chamber of glass and shadow beneath the manufactorum's heart. Hundreds of data crystals floated in suspension fields, their glow breathing in time with the hum. In their faint light I saw faces reflected, not flesh but flickers, half-born shapes that mimicked life for only an instant before dissolving. "These are their voices," Alta said, echoes caught in the circuits before deletion. He reached into the air and touched one of the floating crystals. A shiver of light ran through it and a whisper filled the room. Not words, sighs, fragmented syllables, memories half erased. A worker laughing. A prayer spoken through tears. The sound of welding arcs, then nothing. "Servitors do not die," he continued, turning toward me. "Their flesh burns, their metal is reclaimed, but their command patterns persist. The code does not vanish. It migrates. Each deletion feeds the Forge's network with their ghosts." I stared at the crystals. "You keep them?" "I study them," he said. "The Mechanicus calls it scrap code. Malfunction, corruption. I call it the residue of memory. Every machine remembers its maker." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to think the whispers meant something more than error, that there was purpose in their persistence. But faith had become a fragile thing inside me, cracked by too much noise. All this motion toward a console at the center of the chamber. "Come," he said. "Listen closely." The console was ancient, older than any Mechanicum craft I'd seen, its inscriptions in a dialect that predated High Gothic. I placed my hand upon the surface and the world fell away. For a moment, I was everywhere. I saw the manufactorum as a living organism, arteries of light pulsing through endless tunnels, veins of molten metal carrying thought and heat in equal measure. The servitors were not individuals but neurons, firing commands into the collective mind of the Forge. Every action, every movement fed into a single vast circuit buried beneath Gathus 9's crust. And within that circuit something stirred. Not a machine spirit as the Mechanicus preached. Not a god. Something else. Something that remembered being human. I pulled my hand away, gasping. Aldous watched, unblinking. You felt it, he said. The resonance. You see now what lies beneath function. What is it? I asked. What's beneath us? He tilted his head. Rumor speaks of an ancient intelligence. A fragment of the Men of Iron, perhaps, or the first attempt to mimic the Omnissiah's perfection. The records were purged long ago, but the hum is its heartbeat. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. It calls to us through the remnants of the dead, through the ghosts in the code, and we have been answering without knowing it. I wanted to deny it, to call it heresy, but the hum inside me matched the rhythm of his words. The line between flesh and machine blurred, and for an instant, I felt the servitors pulse within my own veins. All this turned back to the crystals. You hear them, don't you, Cale Varn? The voices? Yes, I said, my throat dry. Always. Then you are already part of it. The realization settled in me like rust in water. The hum was no longer external. It was inside, moving with every heartbeat. I was becoming one of the ghosts I studied. And somewhere deep below the forge, the thing in the dark circuit stirred again and listened back. Altus's chamber was silent after that, no hum. No whisper of coolant lines, only the faint rhythm of my pulse drumming against the metal. He stood still, his optics fixed on the floating crystals. I could see my reflection fractured across their surfaces. Hundreds of distorted versions of myself suspended in amber light, each one twitching slightly out of sync. I wondered how many of those flickers were truly me. The forge is changing, Althus said at last. His voice had softened, as if speaking too loudly might wake something best left sleeping. Gathis 9 is older than the Imperium admits. Beneath the primary manufactoria, below the magma channels, there are vaults. When the first settlers came, they found machinery already humming there. The Mechanicum sealed the gates, called it taboo, and built the new forges on top. But the hum never ceased. And you think this intelligence lies below? I no longer think, he said. I listen. He gestured toward a console embedded in the floor, a shrine of tangled cables and flickering runes. Everything that dies on the line, every deleted pattern, every erased command ends up here. This chamber is a receiver. The ghosts speak through it. We simply forgot how to hear. I took a hesitant step closer. The runes flickered as I approached, shifting from red to gold, then to a color I couldn't name, something that seemed to exist between sight and memory. A voice crackled through the static, soft and feminine, speaking a single word I didn't recognize. The syllables carried a weight that wasn't sound but remembrance. What did it say? I asked. Aldous didn't answer. He had frozen, one hand pressed to his vox grill as if afraid of what might come out. I realized he was trembling. The same word I heard when I first opened this conduit, he said. The same voice. Every time it grows clearer. I leaned closer to the console. The hum was rhythmic again. 4 beats, pause, 3, pause, 2. But now there was a new tone layered beneath it, like a second heart syncing with the first. I felt it in my bones. I knew it as my own. Do you ever wonder, I said, if the servitors dream? Althus turned his head sharply. Dreaming is a malfunction. Then why do they die with purpose? I pressed. Why do they reach for the light? Why do they speak? His optic lenses flared. Because they are the instruments of our sin. He crossed the chamber and tore a purity seal from the nearest crystal. We build obedience from pain, Cale. We take what was once human and hollow it until it sings only our commands. But the flesh remembers. Even when lobotomized, it resists the void. The echo we hear is not divinity. It is guilt, ours, carried by the machine. I stared at him, horrified and yet unable to look away. His trembling had worsened. The skin around his implants was red, raw, and pulsing faintly. Something calls from the deep strata, he whispered. It wears the memory of every soul we've unmade. It is neither omnissiah nor demon, but both and neither. I have felt its presence move through the circuits searching for new voices. And if it finds them, it will build itself anew from us.